So I've always wondered, if Jesus was crucified on a Friday but rose on a Sunday morning, how does that equal 3 days in the grave? Some people have tried to solve this issue by saying that Jesus was using inclusive counting here. However, I don't find that argument convincing.
All right, let's see it.
Because in Matthew 12:40, Jesus specifically says that just as Jonah was 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of the great fish, so shall the Son of Man be 3 days and 3 nights in the heart of the earth. So we need 3 days and 3 nights? Exactly. And because Jewish days begin at sunset, if Jesus was crucified on a Friday, and even if we use inclusive counting, then the best we could get is 3 days and 2 nights in the grave. So the math doesn't work out.
So a few things to mention here. The first is that this entire video is going to presuppose the univocality of the biblical text. That is, this creator is imposing the assumption that every single passage in the New Testament agrees with every other single passage in the New Testament. That is to say, they are all accurately representing one single set of events, and they are not disagreeing with each other. There are absolutely no data that support that assumption. It is 100% a dogma, and without that dogma, we have a lot more data to work with. For instance, Matthew is not the earliest telling of this story. Matthew is elaborating on an earlier version of this story that did not include any reference to Jonah or 3 days and 3 nights. In Mark 8, we just see Jesus say, yeah, guess what? No sign. Matthew is adding, well, I'll give you a sign. We're going to give you the sign of Jonah. And then Matthew quotes verbatim the Greek translation of Jonah 1:17. And we see this in a number of places where the author of Matthew adds Hebrew Bible prophecies and then has Jesus fulfill them to the degree that he can tell the story in a way that fulfills them. So if Jonah says 3 days and 3 nights, Jesus is going to fulfill that come hell or high water. And we can still include inclusive counting in order to have Jesus fulfill that. Matthew's not worried about that. We see that in other places in the Hebrew Bible and in other early Jewish literature. For instance, in Esther, chapter 4, verse 16, Esther tells Mordecai to go have the Jewish community fast. Don't eat anything or drink anything for 3 days, day or night. And then the next verse says, after that, I will go into the king. But the verse after that, Esther 5:1, has Esther going into the king on the 3rd day. And so there are fuzzy boundaries to these ideas. And so inclusive counting still works here and is a far more parsimonious, far better solution than what this video is going to do, which is misrepresent and misunderstand ancient Greek conventions.
This is why some people believe that Jesus was actually crucified on a Wednesday. But the Bible says he was crucified right before the Sabbath. And the Jewish Sabbath is Friday sunset to Saturday sunset. It's true that the weekly Jewish Sabbath was Friday sunset to Saturday sunset, but the Jews also had certain holidays, like Passover, which they called high Sabbaths. John 19:31 even specifies that the Sabbath that Jesus was crucified prior to was a Passover, because it specifically says that that Sabbath was a high day.
So this is very subtly misrepresenting the ancient Jewish calendar, which absolutely distinguished between the weekly Sabbath and special festival days that were primarily referred to as holy assemblies or holy convocations, but could also be referred to as Sabbaths. And the misrepresentation is in the fact that sometimes they overlapped, and the weekly Sabbath day was also a festival Sabbath day. So in John 19, when it says they were trying to get the bodies down before the Sabbath, and John parenthetically inserts, because that Sabbath day was a high day, John is saying that was one of those days where the weekly Sabbath overlapped with the festival Sabbath. That is not a regular reference to a festival Sabbath. That is a reference to the overlap of the two.
Furthermore, Mark 16 says that the women bought spices to anoint Jesus' body after the Sabbath. But Luke 23 says that the women prepared these spices before the Sabbath.
So obviously we have two different authors telling two different stories. And so here is where that assumption of univocality is imposed upon the text to tell the text what it is and is not allowed to say.
The best way for this to make sense is a Wednesday crucifixion.
No, the best way to make sense of this is first to better understand ancient Jewish literary conventions, and second, not impose arbitrarily the assumption of univocality.
Because that would mean that the women rested on the Passover Sabbath, Wednesday sunset to Thursday sunset. They bought and prepared the spices, Thursday sunset to Friday sunset, and then they rested on the weekly Sabbath, which is Friday sunset to Saturday sunset. In the original Greek, Matthew 28:1 even specifies that the women arrived at the tomb after multiple Sabbaths.
So this only demonstrates that this creator does not understand Greek. In the New Testament, the plural form of the Greek word for Sabbath can be used in reference to individual Sabbath days, as well as in reference to individual weeks. And we have both usages in this one verse, because lower down in the verse you have a reference to the first of the Sabbaths, which is a reference to the first day of the week. So here's part of the entry for Sabbath in the leading New Testament Greek lexicon, and I've highlighted the part that discusses the neuter plural use of the word for Sabbath in reference to a single Sabbath day. As you can see, it occurs in Philo and Josephus, it occurs in the Septuagint, it occurs in Matthew, Mark, Luke, Acts, and elsewhere. So this theory is pure and utter nonsense and is actually overruling the authority of the Bible. By imposing the presupposition of univocality, we are requiring that the texts all agree, which means where authors disagree, we have to reinterpret what they're saying until they agree, basically silencing the biblical authors and saying, no, you will do what we tell you to do.